The morning sun cast long shadows across the Afghan desert as Captain Sarah Chun adjusted her rifle scope for the third time in 10 minutes. Something felt wrong about this mission, though she couldn't put her finger on exactly what. The intelligence briefing had been routine. Escort a supply convoy through the Helmand province, protect the vehicles carrying medical supplies, and ammunition to forward operating base Miller. Standard procedure for the 3rd Battalion. But Sarah had learned to trust her instincts during her 4 years of combat deployments. The daughter of Taiwanese immigrants who had built a successful restaurant chain in California, Sarah had always been told she was too small, too quiet, too analytical for military service. Her parents had wanted her to become an engineer or doctor, not a soldier. Yet here she was, one of the most respected marksmen in her unit, with confirmed kills that her commanding officers discussed in hushed, admiring tones. The convoy stretched out below her position on the rocky outcrop, 18 heavy vehicles loaded with crucial supplies. MRAP armored trucks, supply transports, fuel tankers, and escort vehicles formed a line nearly half a mile long. Each vehicle represented millions of dollars in military equipment and, more importantly, carried supplies that could save dozens of lives at the remote outpost. Sarah's radio crackled to life. Overwatch, this is command. Convoy is cleared for movement. Intelligence indicates minimal threat assessment for Highway 7 today. She pressed the transmit button on her radio. Command, this is Overwatch. I'm seeing unusual dust patterns to the east. Request additional reconnaissance before convoy moves. There was a pause. Then, Colonel Morrison's voice came through, sharp with impatience. Overwatch, we've had eyes on this route for 72 hours. Satellite imagery shows no hostile movement. The convoy moves in 15 minutes. Sarah lowered her binoculars and studied the terrain again. Highway 7 cut through a natural valley between 2 ridge lines. Perfect terrain for an ambush. The road had been relatively quiet for the past month, which should have been reassuring. Instead, it made her more nervous. In her experience, when the enemy went quiet, they were usually planning something big. Her spotter, Corporal Mike Rodriguez, shifted beside her. Rodriguez had been her partner for 8 months, and they had developed the kind of wordless communication that kept snipers alive. He handed her a cup of coffee from his thermos without being asked. What do you think, Sergeant Chun? Rodriguez asked quietly, using her former rank out of habit. Sarah had been promoted to captain just 6 weeks earlier, but the team still sometimes slipped into old patterns. I think command is making a mistake, Sarah replied. Look at the wind patterns in the valley. See how the dust is moving? There are vehicles down there, probably hidden in those caves we identified last month. Rodriguez adjusted his own scope and studied the area Sarah indicated. After several minutes, he nodded slowly. I see it. Unnatural dust displacement, about 2 clicks east of the planned route. Sarah keyed her radio again. Command, Overwatch requests permission to conduct advanced reconnaissance of grid coordinates 41 SMD 12345 67890. Potential hostile presence detected. This time, Colonel Morrison's response was immediate and irritated. Negative Overwatch. Intelligence assessment is final. Convoy begins movement in 10 minutes. Maintain Overwatch position and provide security during transit. Sarah felt her jaw tighten. She had seen this before, commanders who relied too heavily on intelligence reports and not enough on ground-level observation. Intelligence was crucial, but it wasn't infallible. Satellite images could be hours or even days old. Electronic surveillance could be jammed or fooled. But a trained sniper's eyes, focused through high-powered optics, provided real-time information that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophe. Rodriguez, start plotting backup positions. If this goes south, we're going to need multiple firing points. Her spotter was already moving, identifying covered routes between potential sniper nests along the ridgeline. Sarah had trained her team to think 3 moves ahead, like a chess player. They identified primary targets, secondary targets, escape routes, and rally points before the shooting started, not during. Below them, the convoy began to move. The lead vehicle, an MRAP carrying the convoy commander, pulled onto Highway 7, followed by the first supply truck. Sarah watched through her scope as vehicle after vehicle joined the procession. Each truck represented months of careful logistics, precious resources that couldn't be easily replaced in this remote corner of Afghanistan. The convoy moved at a steady 40 kilometers per hour, maintaining proper spacing between vehicles to minimize damage from roadside bombs. The armored escorts took their positions, 2 MRAPs at the front, 2 at the rear, and 1 in the middle of the formation. Standard convoy security protocol, executed with military precision. Sarah tracked the lead vehicle through her scope, automatically calculating distance, wind speed, and trajectory for different potential targets. Her rifle, a customized M24 sniper weapon system, was zeroed perfectly for these conditions. She had fired thousands of rounds through this particular weapon, and it had never let her down when it mattered most. Movement, Rodriguez reported quietly. 2 o'clock, approximately 1,000 meters. Sarah swung her rifle toward the indicated position. At first, she saw nothing but rocky terrain and sparse vegetation. Then, almost imperceptibly, she caught a glimpse of reflected light, possibly glass or metal, from a position that should have been empty. "I see it," she confirmed. Possible observation post or sniper position. The convoy continued its steady progress along Highway 7, unaware of the potential threat developing on their flank. Sarah faced a dilemma that every soldier in combat knows well: how to balance following orders with protecting lives. Command had been clear about maintaining radio silence unless the convoy was under direct attack. But Sarah's training and experience told her that by the time shooting started, it might be too late for the convoy to escape. She made her decision and keyed the radio one more time. "Command, this is Overwatch. I have positive identification of hostile observation post grid coordinates 41 SMD 12367 67923. Request immediate authorization to engage." The response was swift and angry. "Overwatch, you are ordered to maintain position and observe only. Do not, repeat, do not engage unless convoy is under direct fire. Intelligence indicates no credible threat on this route." Sarah felt frustration building in her chest, but she acknowledged the order. "Roger, Command. Overwatch will maintain observation only." Rodriguez gave her a questioning look. In previous missions, Sarah had sometimes pushed back harder against orders she disagreed with. But this time, she seemed resigned to following Command's directive, even though every instinct told her it was wrong. The convoy reached the halfway point of its journey without incident. Vehicle after vehicle passed through the valley, their diesel engines echoing off the rocky walls. Sarah continued scanning for threats, her rifle moving in smooth arcs as she covered different sectors of the terrain. Then she saw them. Hidden positions that she had suspected were occupied now revealed themselves as her eyes adjusted to the subtle signs of concealment. A piece of camouflage netting that moved slightly against the wind. A shadow that was too regular to be natural. The barely visible outline of a rocket launcher positioned behind carefully arranged rocks. "Rodriguez," she whispered urgently. "Count the positions." Her spotter began a systematic scan of the valley walls, marking each suspected enemy position on his tactical map. After 10 minutes, he looked at Sarah with wide eyes. "I count at least 15 positions, possibly more. This isn't a small harassment attack. This is a major ambush." Sarah felt her blood run cold. The convoy was walking into a carefully prepared kill zone, and Command was refusing to listen to her warnings. She had 2 choices: follow orders and watch disaster unfold, or disobey direct orders to save lives. She thought about the men and women in those vehicles below. Some of them were friends she had served with for years. Others were young soldiers on their first deployment, barely out of training. All of them were depending on her to keep them safe, even if they didn't know it. The lead vehicle was now less than 1 kilometer from what Sarah estimated was the center of the kill zone. Once the convoy entered that area, the enemy would trigger their attack, and escape would become nearly impossible. The narrow valley walls would channel the vehicles into a concentrated area where rocket-propelled grenades and machine gun fire would be devastatingly effective. Sarah made her choice. Rodriguez, start calling targets. We're going to break up this ambush before it starts. Her spotter looked startled. Ma'am, we have direct orders not to engage. I know what our orders are, Sarah replied grimly. I also know what's about to happen if we follow them. Start with the RPG positions. Those are the biggest threat to the convoy. Rodriguez hesitated for a moment, then began identifying targets through his spotting scope. Target 1, RPG team, range 847 meters, wind left to right at approximately 5 kilometers per hour. Sarah adjusted her scope and found the target. 2 insurgents were positioned behind a carefully constructed rock blind, with a rocket-propelled grenade launcher aimed directly at the highway. The angle of their position would allow them to hit the convoy vehicles from the side, where armor protection was weakest. She controlled her breathing and settled into her shooting position. The familiar weight of the rifle, the precise alignment of the crosshairs, the steady rhythm of her heartbeat. Everything focused down to this single moment of decision. The convoy was now just 800 meters from the kill zone. Sarah placed her finger on the trigger and began the smooth, steady pressure that would send a 7.62 millimeters round across nearly a kilometer of desert air to its target. But before she could complete the shot, her radio exploded with urgent transmissions. All units, this is command. Abort convoy movement immediately. New intelligence indicates major hostile presence along Highway 7. Convoy halt and await further orders. Sarah lifted her head from her scope, startled by the sudden change in orders. The convoy vehicles were already slowing, their brake lights visible in the morning sun. Whatever had changed command's mind had happened in the last few minutes. But as Sarah watched the convoy grinding to a halt, she realized they had stopped in the worst possible position, directly in the center of what she now recognized as an elaborate kill zone. The enemy had planned for this contingency, too. Hashtag the kill zone. The convoy had been stationary for less than 2 minutes when Sarah realized the horrible tactical situation unfolding below. The 18 vehicles were now positioned exactly where the enemy had wanted them, strung out along a straight section of highway with high ground on both sides. Every insurgent firing position she had identified now had clear lines of sight to multiple targets. Through her scope, Sarah could see the convoy commander's MRAP at the front of the formation. The vehicle's gunner was scanning the ridge lines with his mounted machine gun, but from his position in the valley, his field of view was severely limited. The rocky terrain that provided perfect concealment for the enemy fighters also created blind spots for the convoy's defensive weapons. Command, this is Overwatch, Sarah transmitted urgently. Convoy position is completely exposed. Request immediate authorization to provide suppressive fire while vehicles withdraw to safer terrain. Colonel Morrison's voice came back tense and distracted. Overwatch, maintain observation only. We're receiving conflicting intelligence reports. Convoy will hold position until we can confirm threat assessment. Sarah felt her stomach drop. Holding position in the kill zone was exactly what the enemy wanted. Every second the convoy remained stationary gave the insurgents more time to coordinate their attack and ensure maximum damage. Corporal Rodriguez had continued cataloging enemy positions, and his count was growing more alarming by the minute. I've got 23 confirmed positions now, he reported quietly. Heavy machine guns, RPGs, and what looks like at least 2 recoilless rifles. Recoilless rifles were particularly dangerous to armored vehicles. The 75mm rounds they fired could penetrate the side armor of most military trucks and even damage heavily armored wraps. Sarah had seen the devastating effects of these weapons in previous engagements. Entire vehicles reduced to burning scrap metal in seconds. She adjusted her scope to examine the recoilless rifle positions more closely. The weapons were expertly camouflaged, positioned to fire down into the valley at an angle that would maximize penetration of vehicle armor. The crews operating them were clearly experienced. Their positioning and preparation indicated professional military training rather than hastily organized militia. The radio crackled with chatter from the convoy vehicles. Sarah could hear the tension in the voices of the drivers and commanders as they realized their vulnerable position. Several vehicles had shut down their engines to reduce noise and heat signatures, but this also meant they would need precious seconds to restart if a rapid escape became necessary. "This is Delta 7, came a transmission from one of the supply trucks. I've got movement on the North Ridge. Looks like personnel with heavy weapons." "Delta 7, this is Convoy 6, the convoy commander responded. "Maintain position and report any direct threats." Sarah wanted to scream into her radio that direct threats were already surrounding the convoy, but her orders were clear: observe only unless the convoy came under fire. The military doctrine made sense in theory, but in practice it meant waiting until people started dying before she could help them. She focused her scope on the position that Delta 7 had reported. Through the high-powered optics, she could clearly see 3 insurgents maneuvering a heavy machine gun into position. The weapon appeared to be a Russian-made PKM, capable of firing 650 rounds per minute of 7.62 mm ammunition. Against the soft-skinned supply trucks, it would be devastating. Rodriguez marked that PKM position as target priority 1. "If this goes hot, that's our first shot." Her spotter made the notation on his tactical map and continued scanning for additional threats. The insurgents were using professional-level tactics with overlapping fields of fire and carefully planned escape routes. This wasn't an opportunistic attack by local militants. It was a precisely orchestrated ambush designed to destroy the entire convoy. Sarah's radio crackled again, this time with a transmission that made her blood run cold. "All units, this is command. Intelligence now confirms major hostile presence along Highway 7. Estimated enemy strength 40 to 50 fighters with heavy weapons. Convoy is ordered to withdraw immediately using emergency procedures." Emergency withdrawal procedures meant the convoy would abandon normal spacing and speed limits, essentially racing for safety while hoping to outrun the ambush. But from Sarah's elevated position, she could see what command couldn't. The enemy had prepared for this contingency too. Hidden positions near both ends of the valley were occupied by fighters with rocket-propelled grenades, positioned to hit the convoy vehicles as they tried to escape. The insurgents had created a classic L-shaped ambush, with the main force positioned along the North Ridge and blocking forces at the valley exits. The convoy engines roared to life in a cloud of diesel exhaust. The lead MRAP began accelerating down the highway, followed by the supply trucks and fuel tankers. But instead of escaping the kill zone, they were driving deeper into it. "Command, this is Overwatch," Sarah transmitted desperately. "Enemy positions are positioned to block withdrawal routes. Convoy is driving into secondary ambush positions. Overwatch, provide supporting fire as needed," came the response. Authorization granted for immediate engagement. Finally, Sarah thought grimly. But by now it might be too late. The first RPG round screamed across the valley and struck the third vehicle in the convoy, a supply truck loaded with medical supplies. The explosion lifted the rear of the truck off the ground and sent it careening into the rocky wall of the valley. Secondary explosions from the cargo indicated that some of the medical oxygen tanks had been ruptured. "Contact! Contact!" came urgent transmissions from multiple convoy vehicles, taking fire from multiple positions. Sarah had already acquired her first target, the PKM machine gun team that posed the greatest threat to the fleeing vehicles. She controlled her breathing and squeezed the trigger smoothly. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and through her scope, she saw the machine gunner drop as her bullet found its target. "Target down," Rodriguez confirmed. "Nice shot." Moving to target 2. But even as Sarah engaged the enemy fighters, she could see the tactical situation deteriorating rapidly. The convoy vehicles were strung out along nearly a kilometer of highway, taking fire from multiple directions simultaneously. The armored escorts were returning fire with their mounted weapons, but the elevated enemy positions provided excellent cover and concealment. A second RPG round struck one of the fuel tankers, and Sarah watched in horror as a massive fireball erupted from the vehicle. The explosion was so intense that she could feel the heat wave, even from her position nearly 2 kilometers away. The burning fuel spread across the highway, creating a barrier that separated the front half of the convoy from the rear. The convoy was now split into 2 separate groups, each fighting for survival in different sections of the kill zone. The lead vehicles, including the convoy commander's MRAP, were trapped between the burning fuel truck and enemy positions at the northern exit of the valley. The rear vehicles were taking fire from the southern positions and couldn't advance past the flames blocking the highway. Sarah engaged target after target, her rifle speaking with deadly precision. Each shot was carefully aimed and accounted for. At this range, with lives hanging in the balance, there was no room for missed shots or wasted ammunition. Rodriguez called targets and confirmed hits with mechanical efficiency, their partnership functioning like a well-oiled machine even in the chaos of combat. But for every enemy fighter Sarah eliminated, it seemed like 2 more appeared. The insurgents had clearly prepared extensively for this attack, with multiple fighters assigned to each position and backup weapons ready when primary systems were knocked out. A massive explosion echoed across the valley as another vehicle was hit, this time by what appeared to be a recoilless rifle round. The 75mm shell punched completely through MRAP's side armor and detonated inside the crew compartment. Sarah couldn't see any movement from the vehicle afterward. "Command, this is Overwatch," Sarah transmitted while engaging another target. "Convoy is taking heavy casualties. I count at least 4 vehicles destroyed or disabled. Request immediate air support and medical evacuation. Overwatch, air support is 20 minutes out. Continue providing suppressive fire. 20 minutes might as well have been 20 hours. At the rate vehicles were being destroyed, there might not be a convoy left to rescue by the time help arrived." Sarah noticed that the enemy fire was becoming more coordinated, with multiple positions targeting the same convoy vehicle simultaneously. The insurgents were using military tactics that indicated extensive training and experience. They were also communicating effectively, probably using handheld radios to coordinate their attacks. "Rodriguez, do you see any command positions? Someone is coordinating this attack." Her spotter scanned the ridgeline through his scope. "There, about 1,100 meters northeast. Elevated position with multiple antennas. Looks like a command post." Sarah swung her rifle toward the indicated position. Through her scope, she could see several figures with radio equipment positioned behind a natural rock formation. One of them appeared to be directing the attacks, pointing toward different convoy positions and speaking into a handheld radio. This was the kind of shot that separated expert marksmen from good ones. The range was over a kilometer, the wind was variable due to the valley's geography, and the target was partially concealed. But eliminating the enemy commander might disrupt their coordination enough to give the convoy a chance to escape. Sarah took her time with this shot, compensating for distance, wind, and elevation. She controlled her breathing and waited for the natural pause between heartbeats. When everything was perfect, she squeezed the trigger. The bullet's flight time at that range was nearly 2 seconds, an eternity in combat. Sarah maintained her sight picture and watched the target through her scope. The enemy commander suddenly spun and fell backward, his radio flying from his hands. Almost immediately, Sarah could see the effect of the shot. The coordinated enemy fire became more sporadic, with different positions engaging targets independently rather than following a unified plan. It wasn't enough to stop the attack, but it gave the convoy a brief opportunity to reorganize. The convoy commander used the respite to reorganize his surviving vehicles. The ones trapped in the northern section began a fighting withdrawal, using smoke grenades and suppressive fire to mask their movement. The southern group attempted to push forward past the burning fuel truck to reunite with the rest of the convoy. But Sarah could see that the enemy was adapting to her interference. Several positions had shifted their focus from the convoy to her overwatch position, sending rifle rounds cracking past her location. It was time to move to an alternate firing position before the insurgents could organize a concentrated attack on her team. Rodriguez were compromised. Pack up and move to position 2. They quickly gathered their equipment and move along the ridgeline to a backup position they had identified earlier. The movement took precious minutes, during which Sarah couldn't provide covering fire for the convoy. When she settled into her new position, the tactical situation had changed again, and not for the better. #precision under fire from her new position. Sarah could see that the situation had deteriorated significantly during her movement. 3 more convoy vehicles were now burning wrecks scattered along Highway 7, and the remaining vehicles had been forced to abandon the road entirely. They were attempting to navigate the rocky terrain on either side of the highway, but the heavy trucks and armored vehicles were never designed for cross-country movement in such difficult conditions. 2 of the supply trucks had become trapped in a dry riverbed about 400 meters east of the highway. Their wheels spun uselessly in the soft sand and gravel as enemy fighters closed in on foot to finish them off with rocket-propelled grenades. Sarah could see the crews abandoning the vehicles and taking defensive positions behind the trucks, but they were seriously outnumbered and outgunned. "Priority target," Rodriguez called out, identifying a 3-man RPG team moving toward the trapped trucks. Range 650 meters, moving from left to right. Sarah acquired the target through her scope. The RPG team was using good tactics, moving in short rushes between cover positions and keeping their weapon ready to fire. They were close enough to the stranded convoy vehicles to guarantee hits with their next shots. She led the targets slightly to account for their movement and squeezed the trigger. The lead insurgent carrying the RPG launcher dropped immediately, but the other 2 team members quickly recovered the weapon and continued their advance. Sarah worked the bolt on her rifle smoothly and engaged the second fighter, dropping him before he could reach a covered firing position. The third insurgent abandoned the RPG launcher and pulled out an AK-47, spraying automatic fire in the general direction of Sarah's muzzle flash. The shots went wide, but they served to alert other enemy fighters to her new position. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from several positions as insurgents began directing suppressive fire toward her ridgeline. "We're taking heat," Rodriguez observed with characteristic understatement as bullets cracked overhead. "Maybe time for another relocation?" "Not yet," Sarah replied grimly. "Those guys in the riverbed won't last long without support." She shifted her focus to the insurgent positions that posed the most immediate threat to the stranded convoy personnel. A heavy machine gun team had set up in a position that allowed them to fire down into the riverbed, and they were systematically destroying the truck's cargo with sustained bursts of fire. Medical supplies, ammunition, and food were scattered across the sand as rounds tore through the vehicles. Sarah engaged the machine gun team with rapid, precise shots. Her first round took out the gunner, but the assistant gunner quickly moved to take over the weapon. Sarah's second shot eliminated him as well, but she knew it was only a temporary solution. The insurgents would replace the crew within minutes unless she could destroy the weapon itself. She adjusted her aim to target the machine gun's receiver, a much smaller target that required exceptional accuracy. Her shot struck the weapon's ammunition feed mechanism, rendering it inoperable. The enemy fighters would need time to repair or replace the weapon before it could threaten the convoy again. But Sarah's precision shooting had attracted serious attention from the insurgent forces. She could see multiple teams moving to flank her position, and incoming fire was becoming increasingly accurate. Several rounds struck the rocks near her head, sending stone fragments flying. "Ma'am, we've got company," Rodriguez warned, pointing to a group of 6 insurgents moving up the backside of the ridge. "They're trying to get behind us." Sarah made a quick tactical assessment. She could continue providing long-range support for the convoy, but if enemy fighters reach her position, both she and Rodriguez would be overwhelmed quickly. On the other hand, abandoning her overwatch position might condemn the stranded convoy personnel to death. She chose a third option. "Rodriguez, take the rifle and maintain suppressive fire on any targets threatening the convoy. I'm going to deal with our flanking problem. Her spotter looked startled. Ma'am, you're not seriously thinking of engaging 6 fighters at close range? Sarah was already pulling out her M4 carbine and checking her ammunition. Sometimes you have to take the fight to them. Keep those convoy guys alive. I'll be back in 10 minutes. She moved quickly down the back slope of the ridge, using natural cover to mask her approach toward the insurgent flanking team. Sarah had always been better at close-quarters combat than most people expected. Her small stature and quiet demeanor often caused enemies to underestimate her capabilities, a mistake they rarely survived to repeat. The insurgents were climbing the ridge in single file, following a goat trail that offered the easiest route to Sarah's former position. They were focused on reaching the top of the ridge and hadn't posted rear security, a tactical error that Sarah intended to exploit fully. She positioned herself behind a boulder about 30 meters from the trail and waited. Patience was crucial. She needed to let the entire group pass her position before engaging, or some of them might escape to threaten Rodriguez. The first insurgent passed her hiding spot, breathing heavily from the climb and focused on the terrain ahead. The second and third fighters followed, then the fourth and fifth. Sarah waited until the last fighter in the group was directly in front of her position before opening fire. Her M4 carbine spoke with rapid, controlled bursts. The insurgents had no warning and no time to take cover. In less than 15 seconds, all 6 fighters were down. Sarah quickly checked each position to ensure none of them were still capable of fighting, then began her climb back up the ridge. Rodriguez's voice crackled through a radio earpiece. Overwatch, the convoy vehicles in the riverbed are attempting to break out. They're taking heavy fire from multiple positions. Sarah reached her overwatch position and quickly assessed the situation through her rifle scope. The convoy personnel had abandoned their disabled trucks and were attempting to reach a defensive position in the rocky terrain east of the riverbed. But they were being pursued by at least a dozen insurgent fighters, and several convoy members appear to be wounded. I see them, Sarah confirmed. Engaging pursuing forces. She settled into her shooting position and began systematically eliminating the insurgents chasing the convoy personnel. At ranges between 2 and 400 meters, her rifle was devastatingly effective. Each shot was carefully aimed and accounted for, and the pursuing fighters began dropping one by one. The convoy personnel reached a defensive position among the rocks and began returning fire with their personal weapons. But they were still outnumbered and couldn't hold their position indefinitely without support. Sarah's radio crackled with an urgent transmission from the convoy commander. Overwatch, this is Convoy 6. We've got wounded personnel and are running low on ammunition. Can you provide covering fire for extraction? Roger, Convoy 6. I can suppress enemy positions, but you'll need to move fast. Air support is still 15 minutes out. Sarah began engaging targets in a systematic pattern, forcing the insurgent fighters to keep their heads down while the convoy personnel attempted to reach safer terrain. Her ammunition supply was getting critically low. She had started the mission with 40 rounds, and by her count, she had fewer than 10 remaining. Each shot had a count now. Sarah focused on the enemy fighters who posed the greatest threat to the escaping convoy personnel, prioritizing targets with heavy weapons or those in positions that allowed them to fire effectively at the fleeing soldiers. Rodriguez was calling targets and confirming hits with mechanical precision, but Sarah could hear the tension in his voice. They were both acutely aware that their ammunition wouldn't last much longer, and the enemy had superior numbers and position. Contact rear, Rodriguez suddenly called out. We've got more insurgents coming up the ridge behind us. Sarah spun around to see another group of enemy fighters climbing toward their position. These insurgents had learned from the fate of the previous flanking force and were approaching more carefully, using cover and advancing in short rushes. She was now facing the nightmare scenario that every sniper fears. Enemies approaching from multiple directions while friendly forces depend on continued fire support. Sarah had to choose between protecting herself and Rodriguez were continuing to provide covering fire for the convoy personnel, still trapped in the valley. Rodriguez, how many rounds do you have for your M4? 6 magazines, he replied grimly. Take them and hold off the flanking force. I'll continue supporting the convoy with a rifle until my ammo runs out. Rodriguez looked at her with concern. Ma'am, if those guys get close enough to rush our position, then we'll deal with that when it happens. Right now, those convoy personnel need every second of covering fire we can give them. Sarah turned back to her rifle and resumed engaging targets in the valley. She could hear Rodriguez's M4 firing in controlled bursts behind her as he engaged the approaching insurgents. The sound of incoming fire was getting closer, with bullets striking the rocks around their position with increasing frequency. Through her scope, Sarah could see that the convoy personnel were making progress towards safer terrain. They had reached a position about 800 meters from the riverbed, where the rocky ground provided better cover from enemy fire. But they were still being pursued by insurgent fighters, and several convoy members were clearly struggling with wounds. Sarah's rifle bolt locked back on an empty chamber. She was out of ammunition. Rodriguez, I'm dry. How are you doing back there? 4 magazines left, but they're getting closer. I count at least 8 fighters, maybe more. Sarah pulled out her M4 carbine and checked her remaining ammunition, 3 magazines plus the one in the weapon. Not much for a sustained firefight, but it would have to be enough. She moved to a position where she could support Rodriguez while still maintaining visual contact with the convoy personnel. The insurgents approaching their position were using effective small unit tactics, advancing under covering fire while their companions suppressed Sarah's position. The sound of rotor blades suddenly echoed across the valley. Sarah looked up to see 2 AH-64 Apache attack helicopters approaching from the north. The air support had finally arrived, though whether it was in time remained to be seen. All ground units, this is Falcon Flight. We have eyes on multiple hostile positions. Friendlies, mark your positions with smoke. Sarah grabbed a smoke grenade from her equipment and activated it, throwing the green smoke canister into the open area near her position. In the valley below, she could see the convoy personnel marking their position with red smoke. The Apaches immediately began engaging the insurgent positions with their 30mm chain guns and Hellfire missiles. The devastating firepower of the attack helicopters transformed the battlefield in minutes. Enemy positions that had been nearly impossible to assault with small arms fire were obliterated by precision missile strikes. But the insurgents attacking Sarah's position were too close to the friendly forces for the helicopters to engage safely. Sarah and Rodriguez would have to deal with that threat themselves. The enemy fighters were now less than 50 meters away and preparing for a final assault on the Overwatch position. Sarah could see them gathering for a coordinated rush that would overwhelm her and Rodriguez through sheer numbers. She made one final tactical decision that would determine whether any of them survived the next few minutes. The final stand. Sarah's decision came down to basic mathematics and tactical reality. 8 insurgent fighters armed with automatic weapons were preparing to assault their position. She and Rodriguez had limited ammunition and no escape route that wouldn't expose them to concentrated enemy fire. Traditional defensive tactics would result in both of them being overrun within minutes. But Sarah had learned unconventional tactics during her years of combat experience. Sometimes the best defense was an aggressive offense that caught the enemy completely off guard. Rodriguez, when I give the signal, laid down suppressive fire on the left side of their formation. I'm going to flank them from the right. Her spotter looked at her with disbelief. Ma'am, that's suicide. They'll cut you down before you get 20 meters. Not if they're focused on your position. Trust me on this one. Sarah gathered her remaining fragmentation grenades, 3 left from her standard loadout, and checked her M4 carbine one final time. The weapon was clean and properly zeroed, though she had only used it for close-range engagements during this mission. At the ranges she was about to operate, precision would be less important than speed and aggression. She studied the terrain between her position and the insurgent formation, A shallow drainage cut ran along the eastern side of the ridge, offering concealed movement for most of the distance to the enemy position. If she could reach the drainage undetected, she could attack the insurgent flankers from their blind side, while Rodriguez kept them focused on the main overwatch position. Rodriguez, give me 30 seconds to get into position, then open fire. Keep their heads down, but conserve ammunition. You'll need to sustain fire for at least 2 minutes. Sarah moved quickly but quietly along the ridge, using natural cover to mask her movement from the insurgent positions. The drainage cut was deeper than it had appeared from her overwatch position, providing excellent concealment as she advanced toward the enemy fighters. Behind her, Rodriguez opened fire with controlled 3-round bursts, sending 5.56 millimeters rounds cracking just over the insurgents' heads. The suppressive fire had its intended effect. The enemy fighters immediately focused their attention on his muzzle flashes and began returning fire toward the overwatch position. Sarah reached the end of her concealed approach route. The insurgent formation was now less than 30 meters away, with their backs toward her position. They were spread out in a tactical line, preparing to rush Rodriguez's position under covering fire. Their discipline and coordination indicated professional training rather than militia fighters. She pulled the pin from her first fragmentation grenade and counted down the timing carefully. Fragmentation grenades had a 4-second delay after the lever was released, enough time for an enemy to pick up the grenade and throw it back if not properly cooked off. Sarah held the grenade for 2 seconds before throwing it into the center of the insurgent formation. The explosion scattered the enemy fighters and eliminated at least 2 of them immediately. Sarah was already moving as the grenade detonated, using the shock and confusion to close the remaining distance to the enemy position. Her M4 carbine fired in rapid, aimed shots as she engaged the surviving insurgents at close range. The first fighter to recover from the grenade blast took 2 rounds center mass and dropped his weapon. The second tried to bring his AK-47 to bear on Sarah's position, but was eliminated before he could fire. The remaining insurgents attempted to reorganize and return fire, but Sarah's aggressive assault had disrupted their tactical coordination. Instead of a disciplined military formation, they were now individual fighters reacting to unexpected contact from an unexpected direction. Sarah used her second fragmentation grenade to suppress 3 insurgents who had taken cover behind a large boulder. The explosion forced them to abandon their covered position and expose themselves to her rifle fire. She eliminated 2 of them before the third managed to escape into the broken terrain further down the ridge. Rodriguez had ceased fire from the overwatch position, recognizing that Sarah was now engaged in close combat with the enemy forces. The sudden quiet was almost more unnerving than the constant noise of battle had been. Sarah methodically checked each insurgent position to ensure no fighters were still capable of resistance. Combat experience had taught her that wounded enemies could still pose significant threats if not properly neutralized. She found 1 fighter still alive, but seriously wounded by grenade fragments. Following rules of engagement, she provided basic first aid and moved him to a position where he couldn't threaten friendly forces. Rodriguez, area secure. All hostiles neutralized or disabled. Roger that. Good work down there. The Apaches have finished mopping up the valley positions, and the convoy survivors are being extracted. Sarah climbed back up the ridge to her overwatch position, feeling the adrenaline of close combat beginning to fade. The valley below was now quiet except for the sound of helicopter rotor blades and the crackling of burning vehicles. The Apache attack helicopters had been devastatingly effective against the fixed insurgent positions, eliminating dozens of enemy fighters who had thought themselves safely concealed. But the cost had been enormous. From her elevated position, Sarah could count the remains of 11 convoy vehicles scattered along Highway 7 and the surrounding terrain. Each destroyed vehicle represented millions of dollars in military equipment, but more importantly, each represented soldiers who might have been killed or wounded in the attack. Overwatch, this is Falcon Flight. came a transmission from one of the Apache pilots. "We're seeing survivors gathering at grid coordinates 41 SMD 12445 67834. Can you confirm friendly personnel at that location?" Sarah trained her rifle scope on the indicated coordinates and saw a group of convoy survivors organizing a defensive perimeter around 3 wounded soldiers. The survivors had established proper security and were displaying the correct recognition signals, but several appear to be injured. "Falcon Flight, this is Overwatch. Confirmed friendly personnel at that grid. I count 12 survivors with at least 3 requiring immediate medical attention." "Roger, Overwatch. Medical evacuation helicopters are inbound. Estimated arrival 15 minutes. Sarah began conducting a systematic assessment of the battlefield while waiting for the medical evacuation aircraft. The insurgent attack had been far more sophisticated than Command's intelligence had indicated. The enemy forces had demonstrated professional-level tactics, coordination, and equipment that suggested extensive training and support. The ambush positions had been expertly prepared, with overlapping fields of fire and multiple escape routes. The insurgents had also shown remarkable discipline, maintaining radio silence and concealment until the convoy was positioned exactly where they wanted it. This level of tactical sophistication indicated planning and preparation over weeks or months, not a hastily organized attack. Rodriguez was documenting the engagement with his digital camera, photographing enemy positions, and equipment for intelligence analysis. "Ma'am, take a look at this," he called, indicating an insurgent position they hadn't identified during the battle. Sarah examined the position through her scope. It was a sophisticated observation post equipped with high-quality optical equipment and communication gear. The position had been occupied, but showed no signs of combat damage. The insurgents who operated it had escaped during the Apache helicopter attacks. "Command post," Sarah concluded. They were probably coordinating the entire ambush from this position. The observation post was positioned to provide excellent visibility of Highway 7 and the surrounding terrain. From this location, enemy observers could have tracked convoy movements for hours before the attack, ensuring that their forces were in position at exactly the right time. Sarah's radio crackled with a priority transmission from Colonel Morrison. "Overwatch, this is Command. Preliminary casualty reports indicate 7 Kia and 15 wounded from the convoy. Your actions undoubtedly prevented much higher casualties. Well done. 7 killed in action." Sarah felt the familiar weight of combat loss settling on her shoulders. 7 soldiers who had been alive and joking with their colleagues that morning were now dead because Command had ignored her warnings about the route security. The mathematics of combat were brutal and unforgiving. Her precision shooting had saved lives, but not enough lives. "Command, this is Overwatch. Request permission to conduct battle damage assessment while medical evacuation is in progress." "Permission granted. Intelligence analysts want detailed documentation of enemy positions and equipment." Sarah and Rodriguez spent the next hour methodically examining the insurgent positions they had engaged during the battle. The enemy fighters had been equipped with a mixture of Soviet-era and modern Western weapons, suggesting a sophisticated supply network. Several of the rocket-propelled grenade launchers were relatively new models that weren't typically available to militia forces. Most disturbing was the evidence of extensive preparation. The insurgents had constructed elaborate camouflage positions, some of which appeared to have been occupied for weeks. They had also pre-positioned ammunition and supplies, indicating advanced knowledge of convoy schedules and routes. "Rodriguez, look at this," Sarah called, examining one of the machine gun positions. "They've got range cards for specific points along Highway 7. This wasn't an opportunistic attack. They knew exactly when and where the convoy would be. Range cards were detailed measurements of distances to specific landmarks, allowing machine gunners to engage targets accurately without time-consuming range estimation. Creating accurate range cards required extensive observation time and indicated professional military training. The medical evacuation helicopters arrived with the distinctive sound of twin-rotor Chinook aircraft. Sarah watched through her scope as medical personnel quickly assessed and treated the wounded convoy survivors. The efficiency and professionalism of the medical teams was impressive, but she knew that for 7 families, no amount of medical skill could undo the day's losses. As the evacuation helicopters departed with the wounded, Sarah began her final assessment of the engagement. From a tactical perspective, the mission had been successful. The convoy had been attacked, but the majority of personnel had survived and been successfully evacuated. Her precision rifle work had eliminated numerous enemy fighters and disrupted their coordinated attack. But from a strategic perspective, the engagement revealed serious failures in intelligence collection and analysis. Command had assessed the route as low risk despite clear evidence that insurgent forces were operating in the area with sophisticated equipment and tactics. Sarah's radio crackled with another transmission from Colonel Morrison. Overwatch, return to base for debrief. Transport helicopter inbound to your position. As she packed her equipment and prepared for extraction, Sarah reflected on the day's events. She had followed her training and instincts, adapting to changing tactical situations while maintaining focus on the primary mission, protecting friendly forces. But the price had been high, and she couldn't help wondering if different decisions by command might have prevented the ambush entirely. The sound of an approaching UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter signaled the end of her involvement in the Highway 7 engagement. As Sarah and Rodriguez gathered their equipment and prepared for extraction, she took one final look at the valley below. The destroyed convoy vehicles were still burning, sending black smoke columns into the desert sky. The battlefield was littered with evidence of the sophisticated insurgent attack and the devastating response by Apache helicopters. But for Sarah, the most important statistic was that 26 convoy personnel had survived an attack that could easily have killed them all. Sometimes in the brutal mathematics of combat, that had to be enough. #The aftermath, the helicopter ride back to forward operating base Wilson gave Sarah time to process what had happened during the Highway 7 engagement. Through the aircraft's small windows, she could see the black smoke columns still rising from the destroyed convoy vehicles, visible from over 10 kilometers away. The sight would be etched in her memory alongside dozens of other combat experiences that had shaped her understanding of warfare's brutal realities. Rodriguez sat across from her in the helicopter's cargo compartment, methodically cleaning his equipment with the focused attention that combat veterans use to cope with post-battle stress. His spotting scope, rangefinder, and tactical maps were arranged with military precision, each item serving as a tangible connection to their successful mission despite the overall tragedy of the convoy attack. The debriefing at the base would be extensive and detailed. Intelligence analysts would want to understand every aspect of the insurgent attack, their tactics, equipment, coordination, and escape routes. Sarah's observations from her Overwatch position would be crucial for developing countermeasures against similar ambushes in the future. But beyond the tactical analysis, Sarah knew there would be difficult questions about command's decision-making process. Her repeated warnings about potential threats along Highway 7 had been dismissed based on intelligence assessments that proved catastrophically wrong. 7 soldiers had died because decision-makers had relied on incomplete information instead of trusting experienced ground personnel. The Black Hawk helicopter descended toward the landing zone at FOB Wilson, its rotor wash kicking up clouds of dust from the desert floor. Sarah could see the base's defensive positions and guard towers, all designed to protect the several hundred military personnel who called this remote outpost home. It was a small piece of American territory in a hostile land, maintained through constant vigilance and firepower. As the helicopter touched down, Sarah was met by Major Patricia Williams, the battalion intelligence officer. Williams was known for her thorough approach to tactical analysis and her willingness to challenge conventional thinking when the evidence warranted it. "Captain Shun, I need a complete debrief on the Highway 7 engagement as soon as possible," Williams said as they walked toward the operations center. Intelligence Command is sending a team from Kabul to investigate what went wrong with our threat assessment. The operations center was buzzing with activity as staff officers compiled reports and coordinated ongoing operations. Multiple radio nets crackled with traffic from patrols and checkpoints throughout the region, creating a constant background of operational chatter. Large-screen displays showed real-time intelligence feeds and surveillance footage from unmanned aerial vehicles. Sarah settled into a chair at the debriefing table, accepting a cup of coffee from one of the intelligence analysts. The familiar routine of post-mission documentation was both comforting and exhausting, recounting every detail of the engagement while emotions were still raw from combat. Let's start with your initial observations. Major Williams began, activating a digital recorder. You reported suspicious activity along the planned convoy route several hours before the attack. Tell me exactly what you saw. Sarah described her observations in chronological order, from the unusual dust patterns that first caught her attention to the systematic identification of insurgent positions throughout the valley. She explained how the enemy fighters had used professional-level camouflage and positioning that indicated extensive training and preparation. The insurgent positions weren't hastily prepared, Sarah emphasized. They showed evidence of weeks or months of preparation, including pre-positioned ammunition and carefully constructed firing positions. This wasn't an opportunistic attack. It was a carefully planned operation. Major Williams made notes on her tablet computer while asking detailed questions about enemy equipment, tactics, and coordination. The intelligence officer was particularly interested in Sarah's assessment of the insurgent command and control procedures. You mentioned eliminating what appeared to be a command position during the engagement. Can you describe the location and equipment you observed? Sarah pulled out her tactical map and marked the position where she had engaged the insurgent commander. Grid coordinates 41 SMD 12367. 67923, elevated position with multiple radio antennas. I observed at least 3 personnel with communication equipment, one of whom appeared to be directing the attack. The elimination of the enemy commander had been a crucial turning point in the engagement, disrupting the insurgents' coordination and allowing the convoy personnel to reorganize their defense. But Sarah was troubled by the implications of what she had observed. Major, the level of tactical sophistication suggests these weren't local militia fighters. The positioning, equipment, and coordination indicated professional military training. Someone with extensive combat experience planned this operation. Williams nodded grimly. That matches other intelligence we've been receiving from the region. There's evidence of foreign fighters with military experience operating alongside local insurgent groups. Your observations will be crucial for understanding their capabilities and tactics. The debriefing continued for over 2 hours as Sarah recounted every detail of the engagement. Rodriguez provided additional information about the insurgent positions he had observed and the effectiveness of different weapon systems during the battle. Together, they painted a comprehensive picture of a sophisticated enemy force that had nearly succeeded in destroying an entire convoy. When the formal debriefing concluded, Major Williams walked Sarah to the base medical facility for the mandatory post-combat health assessment. Military doctrine required all personnel involved in combat engagements to be evaluated for physical and psychological injuries, even if they reported no problems. The base physician, Captain Rebecca Martinez, had extensive experience treating combat-related injuries and stress disorders. She conducted a thorough examination while asking questions about Sarah's physical and mental state following the engagement. Any headaches, dizziness, or ringing in your ears? Dr. Martinez asked, checking Sarah's reflexes with a small hammer. Some ringing from the close-range explosions, but it's already improving, Sarah replied honestly. The fragmentation grenades she had used against the insurgent flanking force had been loud enough to cause temporary hearing damage, but her hearing protection had prevented permanent injury. Dr. Martinez made notes in Sarah's medical file and recommended follow-up examinations over the next week to monitor her condition. The physician had seen enough combat veterans to recognize the signs of stress and trauma, even in soldiers who appear to be coping well with their experiences. Captain Chun, I want you to know that my office is available if you need to talk about what happened today. Losing 7 soldiers is difficult for everyone, even when you did everything possible to prevent it. Sarah appreciated the offer, but wasn't ready to discuss her feelings about the convoy attack. Military culture emphasized resilience and moving forward from traumatic experiences, though she knew that approach didn't work for everyone. Some soldiers needed professional help to process combat trauma, while others found their own ways to cope with the psychological demands of warfare. After the medical evaluation, Sarah returned to her quarters to clean her equipment and write her formal after-action report. The small room she shared with another officer contained the basic necessities: 2 beds, a desk, and lockers for personal belongings. It wasn't comfortable, but it was private space in an environment where privacy was rare. She field-stripped her M24 sniper rifle and began the methodical process of cleaning and inspection that followed every combat engagement. The weapon had performed flawlessly during the engagement, delivering accurate fire at ranges exceeding 1 kilometer. But Sarah knew that mechanical reliability was only part of the equation. Her own skill and judgment had been equally important. As she cleaned the rifle's bolt and barrel, Sarah reflected on the shots she had taken during the engagement. Each round fired had been carefully aimed at a specific target, threatening friendly forces. At the ranges she had been operating, there was no room for error or wasted ammunition. Every shot had a count, and every miss could cost lives. The formal after-action report required detailed documentation of every aspect of the engagement, from initial observations to final casualty counts. Sarah wrote in the clinical, objective style required for official military documents, but the dry language couldn't capture the intensity and complexity of combat decision-making. Her report would become part of a larger investigation into the intelligence failure that had led to the convoy ambush. Command had assessed Highway 7 as low risk despite clear indicators that insurgent forces were operating in the area. The investigation would examine how those indicators had been missed or misinterpreted and what changes were needed to prevent similar failures in the future. But Sarah knew that intelligence gathering would always be imperfect and that soldiers would continue to face unexpected threats in combat zones. The key was maintaining the flexibility and judgment to adapt when situations developed differently than expected. Her decision to engage insurgent forces despite orders to observe only had been validated by the survival of most convoy personnel. 3 days after the Highway 7 engagement, Sarah received orders to report to Colonel Morrison's office for a formal review of her actions during the battle. The meeting would determine whether she had acted appropriately in engaging enemy forces before receiving specific authorization to do so. Colonel Morrison's office was decorated with maps, unit insignia, and photographs from his 30 years of military service. The colonel had commanded units in multiple combat zones and understood the complexities of battlefield decision-making. He gestured for Sarah to take a seat across from his desk. Captain Chun, I've reviewed your actions during the Highway 7 engagement, including your decision to engage enemy forces before receiving explicit authorization. I want to understand your reasoning for that decision. Sarah had prepared for this conversation and responded with the same clarity she brought to tactical situations. Sir, I assessed that the convoy was in immediate danger and that waiting for authorization would result in significant friendly casualties. My judgment was that saving lives took precedence over strict adherence to rules of engagement. Colonel Morrison studied her personnel file while considering her response. Sarah's record showed exceptional performance in previous deployments, with multiple commendations for valor and marksmanship. She had never been involved in friendly fire incidents or questionable tactical decisions. Your assessment proved correct, the colonel acknowledged. Intelligence estimates suggest the convoy would have taken 50% casualties or higher without your intervention. However, we can't have subordinate personnel making independent decisions about when to engage enemy forces. Sarah understood the institutional perspective, even though she disagreed with it in this specific case. Military organizations required discipline and adherence to orders, but they also needed personnel capable of making sound judgments when circumstances changed rapidly. Colonel Morrison closed her file and looked at her directly. That said, your actions were tactically sound and undoubtedly saved lives. You're being recommended for the Bronze Star Medal for Valor Under Fire, and your tactics during the engagement will be incorporated into updated training materials for sniper teams. The Bronze Star was a significant recognition, though Sarah knew it wouldn't bring back the 7 soldiers who had died in the convoy attack. Awards and commendations served institutional purposes, but they couldn't undo the brutal mathematics of combat casualties. After the meeting with Colonel Morrison, Sarah returned to her duties, training other snipers and conducting reconnaissance missions throughout the region. The Highway 7 engagement became part of her growing repository of combat experiences, each one contributing to her understanding of warfare's complexities and moral ambiguities. 6 months later, Sarah received orders transferring her to a training position at Fort Benning, where she would teach sniper tactics to the next generation of military marksmen. The assignment represented recognition of her expertise and leadership potential, though it meant leaving the combat zone where she had served with distinction. On her final day at FOB Wilson, Sarah climbed to the observation tower where she had spent countless hours scanning the surrounding terrain for threats. The view encompassed the harsh beauty of the Afghan landscape, rocky hills, sparse vegetation, and the distant mountains where insurgent forces continued to operate against coalition forces. The Highway 7 convoy route was visible in the distance, now traveled only by heavily escorted military convoys following extensive route security procedures. The lessons learned from that engagement had been incorporated into updated tactics and intelligence procedures, though Sarah knew that determined enemies would continue to find ways to threaten military operations. As she prepared to leave Afghanistan, Sarah reflected on the costs and achievements of her deployment. She had eliminated dozens of enemy fighters who threatened friendly forces, contributed to successful military operations, and mentored junior personnel who would carry on the mission. But she also carried the weight of decisions made under extreme pressure and the knowledge that warfare's moral complexities could never be fully resolved. The helicopter that would begin Sarah's journey home lifted off from FOB Wilson as the sun set over the Afghan desert. Through the aircraft's windows, she could see the lights of the forward operating base growing smaller, until they disappeared into the vast darkness of the hostile terrain that had been her home for the past year. Sarah knew that her war was ending, but the war itself would continue long after she returned to the United States. Other soldiers would face similar tactical dilemmas, make life and death decisions under pressure, and carry the psychological weight of combat experiences. Her contribution had been measured in precision rifle shots and tactical decisions, but the larger questions of strategy and policy remained unresolved. The aircraft climbed toward its cruising altitude, carrying Sarah away from the battlefield, where she had proven herself under the most demanding conditions imaginable. Behind her, the war continued with its relentless cycle of violence and sacrifice, while ahead lay the challenge of transitioning from combat operations to peacetime responsibilities. For Captain Sarah Chun, the Highway 7 engagement would remain a defining moment in her military career, a test of skill, judgment, and courage that she had met with exceptional performance. But she also knew that true victory in war was measured not just in tactical success, but in the broader achievement of peace and security for the people whose freedom soldiers fought to protect.